everyone, this is update for September 15, 2022, day 204 of the war and of the date update. As a summary, there's not much going on the front lines. Today it's relatively quiet. It doesn't mean that things are sort of dying off. It just means that both sides are preparing for next series of probably hits or strikes against each other. The most important part is actually there was quite a bit of Ukrainian activity on Russian-Ukrainian border here, including there was attack at some village here near this town Valuyki here. As a result of that, the Ukrainian side destroyed transformers, so there was no electricity in that region around Valuyki. So this really means is that seems to be that the war is spilling over from Ukrainian borders into neighboring areas of the Russia more and more in pronounced way, so that probably the stretch of the 10-kilometer buffer zone on the Russian side will be abandoned by civilians, and it will be sort of like no man's land in terms of there will be no civilians. There's definitely, obviously, there will be Russian military and so on, but in any case, there's a clear trend in this way, and there was quite a bit of activity along the borderline. At the same time, on the front lines on the Russian side, there's pretty much close to zero activity, especially comparing it to the past. The only area where the Russian command is still doing something is the area which is say controlled by Wagner mercenaries. They're still trying to attack and trying to move forward. That's the only sort of active part of the Russian military. There were some activities really in the morning straight next to Donetsk in Pisky, but that is also sort of dying off, and Russian military is really switching to really sort of call it strategic defensive activities at this point. And as we discussed, they are totally outnumbered at this point by Ukrainian military, and generally this is just a question of time before they're gonna get squeezed out of Ukraine. And the only other sort of unknown in all of this, will there be any encirclement of the Russian troops in the process? So the sort of highest probability candidate is this Kherson bridgehead here that we mentioned many times. This is where the encirclement of Russian troops is extremely realistic scenario. Otherwise, as was proven by the attack, by the offensive in Kupiansk and Balaklia in Zoom, the modern sort of ability of troops to move and escape from the encirclement is extremely high, especially if higher command does not want that to happen, or basically they're not preparing to sacrifice those troops to keep the front line where it is. And it seems that the Russian command is not stubborn and somewhat flexible in this respect. Remains to be seen what's going to happen later, but so far they were pretty flexible, including they were willing to lose not all of the, but significant amount of the equipment, but save people so that they have another chance to fight in the future, which was in that case correct strategy for the Russian side. Now let's actually discuss a little bit, since we have a little bit more time, let's look what's going on with Russian economy, with Russian energy export, just general all of that side. So there is actually emerging, for those who've been with us for quite a while, you remember that we were mentioning that there is significant drop in production in Russian industry that was happening since about like second half of April and really into May, and then things really getting worse and worse. And that drop in industrial activity finally starting to show up and affect Russian finances. So what's happening is that Russian state budget collecting less and less revenue. So the drop started in June, then it continues in July and August. So this is just drop, and the drop is happening not because of the reduction in volume of Russian energy export. That's not the source of this. The source of it is drop in VAT collection, which is value added tax. This is mostly either import or internal activity in the country. So again, all of that drop in industrial manufacturing is starting to catch up to the Russian state budget, where the revenues are dropping. And then there is a next sort of domino that's kind of like coming from this, because the revenues are dropping, expenses are still high, and there is a need to finance this war, which is expensive activity by itself. Then it's Russian budget for the past, I think, 2 months, is August and July, is in deficit, which is, for Russia, it's super unusual situation. It's normal sort of in the West everywhere that people, the countries spend more than they earn. But in Russia, it was completely opposite for quite a long time, probably since early 2000, where Russian budget is always sort of in a surplus, right? So flipping into deficit is extremely unusual situation in Russia. What this really means, that this is our first signs of the crack in Russian financial situation, which up till probably this time, up until June, was in pretty good, rock solid state, and there is no problems at all. Now we clearly see the cracks. They are small. This is not, we couldn't say this is the end of the world. No, it's sort of the trend. The most important is the trend is in the negative direction. That's what's really happening. Eventually, this will affect Russian currency and so on, but this is still far away, because Russian state has significant, I would say, huge buffer of FX reserves that they can still use to fund everything and so on. So this is really far away, but this is just the emergence of the new trend, let's put it this way. At the same time, Russian government, Russian business leaders, they actively looking how to sell oil and gas resources on the world market. And as we mentioned, there is no problem essentially with selling oil. They smuggle it and all that stuff, because the margin is so big that you really cannot stop with any kind of sanctions. This is futile attempt and so on. The only sort of area where what's somewhat more hurt was natural gas, because the supply, as we all know, dropped significantly, almost to a standstill now to Europe, which was the main consumer for Russia. The Russia still sells small amount, because only Nord Stream 1 was shut off there. The other one that's going from through Ukraine, actually surprisingly, is still working, still pumping Russian natural gas to Europe. There's also some of it is flowing through Turkey. So there is still flow of natural gas. So, and because the prices are so big, so high in Europe, that's more than compensates lost volume of sales to Europe. However, Russian leadership is pretty proactive, and they talking with China how to diversify and start supplying natural gas to Chinese market, which is obviously big. There is currently one pipeline that started supply of natural gas in 2019, I believe, to China. The capacity is not big; it's only 32 billion cubic meters. Just for the reference, the export market for Gazprom, which is the state monopoly for producing and exporting natural gas out of Russia, could be around 200 billion cubic meters, plus minus. So as you can see, that's sort of relatively small amount. What sort of Russian leadership is actually negotiating right now, probably try to negotiate with Chinese leadership, is to build another pipeline that would be 50 billion cubic meters to China. The problem with this export to China is that economics is not that great at all, because China is trying to really negotiate extremely low prices. So they don't like the best sort of buyers of this world. They extremely shrewd. They never overpay, and I would say they tend to underpay in most circumstances. Just as a general, they extremely shrewd business people, and so that really, and plus the length of the pipeline is extremely long. So and it goes through relatively like remote areas of Russia, so the cost to construct it is also relatively high. So basically, you really need price of natural gas at least like $500 per 1,000 cubic meters to make it sort of somewhat profitable. Given this whole situation where the world is going, with governments in the West trying to destroy production of oil and gas, probably the prices of oil and gas will stay elevated, even though there is another countering force, which is increasing interest rates by Federal Reserve, and essentially what that really puts deflationary pressure on everything, on all assets and commodities as well. At the same time, this is kind of like a balance by the reduction in the production of specifically oil and gas, and also to extend food as well. So we don't think that the prices will go down as much. Anything is possible, but the prices definitely will go down because literally there's a shortage of dollars developing in the world economy, and so that definitely will put pressure. At the same time, there is still quite significant demand around the world for energy. So this is kind of like Russian leadership hopes is essentially to diversify eventually supply of natural gas to Asia. Also, in addition, Japan increased buying of Russian natural gas in the form of LNG by 200%. So as you can see, there's huge demand in Asia and many countries. And by the way, there is also Malaysia and Indonesia, I believe, are also showing interest to buy Russian crude oil. So the question of morality doesn't apply there as much. It's only just pure business, and that's it. I'm not saying that the West is sort of also not considering that, but the weight of morality in the consideration is close to zero in that part of the world. It is what it is. There's just reality of the life. That's how culturally people apparently look there. So this is kind of like what's going on sort of with the Russian economy. As I said many times before, Ukrainian economy is essentially at this point totally wiped out, giving all of this electricity blackouts. And this is probably not the end. This is just the start of it. They will probably there will be probably more Russian strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure. So essentially the only parts, as I mentioned, of the economy that can still produce some value add is agriculture, as long as the ports are open, and then some IT outsourcing. But that IT outsourcing is going to be under pressure because of the rising interest rates environment, and that really puts pressure on the tech sector in general, not in Ukraine, but obviously it's all Ukraine is working. IT sector is really working for the West essentially, and so there only may be something other sort of area where Ukrainians can still make something is steel production, but again, steel production will be probably severely affected by this upcoming deflationary pressures, basically. So Ukraine becoming really dependent on the financial help and obviously military help. I'm not even talking about that for sure. From the West, and recently European Union decided finally to release 5 billion euros in financial aid. It seems, based on what we understand, most of it is in the form of grants, which means you don't need to repay. It's kind of like free money, as opposed to loans, which totally makes sense because Ukrainian economy will not be able to repay it in any near future, and in general, and it's just even after the war is over, there's huge amount of capital that needs to be spent on rebuilding destroyed infrastructure, basically. There is also some news in terms of Ukrainian refugees. So there are different estimates how many people left Ukraine, but the estimate is about 9 million. So there was a report from European Union that about 5 million out of 9 million returned back to Ukraine. So there's still 4 million of Ukrainians, like in Europe. Some of them probably also went, to Canada and in the US, basically spreading around the world essentially from the economic misery and all of that. So this is, so as you can see, this is not only infrastructure problem, not only this destruction of that, but also tremendous loss of human capital. That's actually, if anything, that's the worst part of everything that Ukraine is experiencing. Not so much sort of physical sort of assets, because if you have people, you can always rebuild those. But if you don't have people, you cannot do anything, because in the end, it's all driven by people. And Ukraine will face an extremely challenging situation after the war is over with its human capital, because probably the most sort of entrepreneurial, people who want to sort of do something, they probably fled Ukraine in droves, given this whole circumstances, and giving also seeing that Ukrainian government is extremely, I would say, I'll be very blunt, extremely corrupt, inept, and really steering country in the wrong direction as a whole. Because the recent trend in Ukrainian government, they started tightening the screws by basically increasing taxes here and there, because since the beginning of the war, there was kind of like there was a lot of like the taxes kind of like were significantly reduced basically for many things. So now there is slow process since about let's say beginning of June, where more and more increase in taxes is happening, and it's returning back to the economic environment, which is extremely suffocating for anyone who wants to do business or do anything economically in Ukraine, and it's basically returning to that. But on top of that, you also adding this pressure from the war. It's a recipe for total disaster and recipe for total loss of the human capital, because people are not stupid. You cannot fool all of the people. You may, as I said, you may fool some people for some time. You cannot fool everyone for a long time. So this is really what's happening, and people vote with their feet essentially at large. That's a big problem. There is a lot of corruption cases, and I plan to discuss some big high-profile corruption scandal that's erupting in Ukraine that actually happened I think started on August 31st. So I'll discuss that probably tomorrow. But essentially, with this sort of leadership and governance, the future of Ukraine is extremely bleak, basically, even after it sort of defends itself against Russian aggression. And as we discussed, this is probably more or less sort of done deal, but there is a problem of the future, sort of reconstruction, what happens after the war with Russia, essentially. So that's just kind of like general kind of like discussion. Now let's quickly walk through the front line. As discussed, there is not really much going on. And as mentioned before, there is extremely high activity along the state borders, specifically in Belgorod region. Not just like here, Bryansk is relatively quiet, and then as we go south, it gets a little bit more and more heated. So Kursk, like somewhat more, but really there was quite a bit of activity here with along the Belgorod region, specifically this places Valuki and Shebekino, which are two important hubs for supplying Russian military in Ukraine here, and specifically here in North Luhansk area, essentially, and also as well here. So there were some attacks by Ukrainian forces against apparently transportation infrastructure there, and also, as we mentioned, electricity infrastructure. Now let's look what's going on this North Luhansk section of the front line. Things here are more or less quiet. No sort of activity by Ukrainian forces to kind of continue movement. The situation here with bridgeheads is sort of in a way kind of strange in many ways. So Ukrainian troops are slowly increasing this bridgehead here. So what we know that Ukrainian troops managed to squeeze Russian forces out of this village Studenok and Sosnove. So they're still not on sort of this. They're still not out of this forest area, which is the main immediate goal. And so once they're out of this forest area, then there is opportunity to do really large breakthrough and advances. Nevertheless, we don't see significant and strong effort to basically get out of this foresty area on bridgehead. So there was some relatively weak attacks against Lyman, but nothing really major here. At the same time, I want to say that Russian troops here are weak. They're still weak. They're still few in number. They're still extremely poor on heavy equipment. So there's still opportunity, but for whatever reason, Ukrainian command is not taking advantage of that opportunity. And by the way, all of these units here, they're still kind of like getting and sort of gaining control of this liberated territory. So basically going into all of the villages and basically kind of like putting the Ukrainian administration there. So that might be the reason why it's still delayed, but still it's not good excuse, sort of say. Now let's move. This is a kind of like a big picture situation in this North Luhansk section of the front line. So this is this town Valuki, where there's a lot of activity. There's a good amount of shelling that was done by Ukrainian troops in this area. Now let's move. Let's see what's going on in this North Donbass section of the front line. As I mentioned, most of the activity of the Russian troops are only sort of in this area. They're still trying to attack Soledar, still trying to attack Bakhmut. As you can see, they're still trying to squeeze Ukrainian troops here. Vesela Dolina, so basically this, especially this sort of southern section, which is manned by Wagner mercenaries. They just keep going, sort of to say. They don't stop. As we said, that this is at this point it's essentially futile activity, but nevertheless they do it. Now let's move to central Donbass section of the front line, which is straight west of Donetsk. Things here are essentially dying off on the Russian side. There were some, like, I would say, probing extremely weak attacks out of this Pesky salient and towards Novomikhailivka, but it was all extremely weak to the point that it's like even like stretching it to say that there was any major activity there. Let's just keep going. Let's see what's going on Zaporizhy section of the front line. Things here are pretty much quiet. No new reports by Russian side that Ukrainian command is accumulating troops in Vuhledar. So remains to be seen where the sort of the strike is going to happen. Now let's move to Kherson bridgehead. So here, what happened again is Russian forces did another round of rocket strikes, and they hit again this dam here. As you can see, there's a large artificial lake where there's hydropower generation station is, and they hit that dam again to increase basically the flow of the water into Inholets River. And apparently there is another dam somewhere up north, here a little bit in Kirovograd region. They hit that dam as well, and again that water flows into Inholets River to increase the level of the water even further in Inholets in order to sort of stop the advances of Ukrainian troops on Kherson bridgehead here. From what we're seeing, it creates obviously difficulties, there's no question, but it doesn't prevent Ukrainian troops from being resupplied sort of like on this bridgehead on the eastern side of Inholets River. So everything is still working, the machine is still working. It didn't sort of stop, didn't change anything, but it for sure it created some difficulties. So at the same time, Russian side is also experiencing extreme difficulties in resupplying their troops. So there is definitely lack of artillery support of the Russian troops here, and since they are outnumbered, they are sort of on defensive, being sort of pushed. There are even reports that basically Ukrainian commander units are infiltrating because there is no perfect contiguous front line here, that they sort of even getting as far as Cherivne here, as you can see. So this is really almost halfway to ultimate goal of this dam here near Novokakhovka. So things are for sure getting worse by day for the Russian forces here. They're still holding on, and largely obviously thanks to this airborne units, to these two airborne divisions and this special forces brigade. It's really, if they didn't have at least one of those, this whole thing probably would already collapse by now in very disorderly fashion, meaning there will be total destruction of bridgehead and a lot of prisoners of war and captured equipment. But Ukrainian command continues pressure here, except it's just it is harder area to attack, and we also think that the quality of the command at all levels, sort of starting from the top till very down, is lower here relatively to what we saw in Kharkiv region. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow, bye bye.